Well, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Tristan Bunell here today to chat with us. For those of you who don't know Tristan, although I'm sure most people will know Tristan, he's quite famous in international education. He is an assistant professor, lecturer in international education out of University of Bath. He has over 70 plus articles and books. He's got a book coming out fairly soon. Perhaps we'll get to that today, talk about issues around precariousness of the international teacher. He is an all-round great guy. I know him quite well, and he brings a different background that you'll often see with professors and researchers, in that Tristan had worked as a teacher and as an IB coordinator in international schools. So he's actually worked on the front lines. And maybe, Tristan, that's the best way to jump into our conversation today. A little bit about your background and how you came to Bath, 2014, and what you brought with you to Bath, and maybe how that shaped how you look at issues around research and in particular international education.
Yeah, thanks, James. Okay, so I entered. I'm what some people in literature now call an accidental teacher. So there's this sort of new categorization of international school teachers starting to appear. So I originally taught in a state school, comprehensive school in Oxford, for a year, and then a colleague, somebody at the school, went to work in an international school, and he started teaching the IB, which I'd never heard of at the time. This was 1990, and then a job came up at the International School of London in 1990 to teach IB DP. Obviously, there was just the DP at the time. That was the only program the IB had. There were 400 IB schools around the world, 24 in the UK, and there were about 700 international schools. And I got a job at the International School of London, which you might call a Type A international school. So it had been set up to, although it was quite ideological as well, it had been set up by an Oxford graduate who believed in global peace, and he just had a little bit of money to open up a school. And then there was a lot of embassy kids there, and people working for multinational companies and missionary people, etc. The usual sort of expatriate people. And they've been doing the IB, one of the first schools in the UK to do the IB. So it was all very different for me. It was a completely new world. And it was a very, very small, insular, quite amateur, fun setup. You know, it was all quite, it was all non-profit. It was all very laid back. It was quite serious, but it was all bit of an experiment. It was all very innovative. There was a big experiment going on, and I really found it really interesting, really exciting. It was so different from the schooling I'd had in Yorkshire, and I stayed there for 14 years, and I saw a lot of changes. Now, that was a long time to be at one international school, because I had a permanent contract. And I saw a lot of changes. I saw it all become a little bit more serious and more professional, which is good. And it obviously got bigger and bigger, and the IB got bigger and bigger, and more programs came in. And the NYP and the PYP, we started doing the continuum. We became a continuum school. Only the second school in the UK to be a continuum school. And then I had the chance to work abroad. So I got a job at the Copenhagen International School, which, for those of you who know the IB, it's 0004. So it's one of the first schools in 1968 to do the IB. So it was a very interesting school. There were still people there that had begun the IB. You know, some of the pioneers were still there. That was 2004 when I went there, and it was still sort of quite a little bit amateurish, a little bit innovative, fun. It's what, it was. And then I was there 10 years. So I'd done 24, 25 years in international schooling, and I saw big changes happening. And there was a definite shift towards a sort of new era, and I wrote a book in 2014, just as I was finishing in Copenhagen for Routledge, and I talked about the ideal era, which I had been part of, and the move towards what I call a post-ideal era, which was characterized by catering for local children, so big demographic changes, for profit, much more for profit, which hadn't been there at all in 1990. Movement away from the IB, movement away from international curricula, which got me thinking about, well, what is international about these schools if they're not teaching international kids, they're not doing the international curriculum, then what is it that makes them international? So I noticed these big changes that were starting to occur, and also not being accredited as well, because the schools I'd been part of, the schools I'd worked at were Council of International School, or ECIS accredited initially. So they were authorized by the IB, they were accredited by CIS, they were members of ECIS, Nordic network of international schools, the London International Schools Association. They had all the badges that go with traditionally go with international schooling in its traditional sort of supply chain, as it were. And when I wrote that book in 2014, things had changed a lot. The number of international schools had just hit 6,000. That was January 2012 when I started writing the book. The number of international schools had hit 6,000. January 2021, they just hit 12,000. So in fact, they've doubled since I started writing since 2012. So, you know, this growth has been enormous, the growth in scale, but also the changes. So there's been two things. There's been a big growth in scale. Over the past 20 years, there's been a growth rate of 2 schools per day. That's from the official. That's from the ISC research database, using a definition that says that international schools are schools that teach wholly or partly in English outside an English-speaking country, except if they're in an English-speaking country. They're delivering an international curriculum. So if you take that definition, it's quite a broad, contestable definition. But if you take that definition, the number of schools is growing by 2 per day. And it's expected to grow. We're expecting the number of international schools to keep doubling for the next 10 years. So I wrote this book for Routledge 2014. That sort of attracted attention, as it were, academically. So I ended up here at the University of Bath, which had a very strong record with the IB. The IB was actually based here at one point in the 1960s, just further along the corridor where I'm sitting, actually. That's how small the outfit was. It was in one room. And also a very strong commitment to international, professional development of international school teachers, etc. So it was a logical place for me to come with the background and the experience that I had. And in that book, in the Routledge book, 2014, The Changing Landscape of International Schooling, the book was called, I raised an issue there about the legitimacy of schools. And I wrote, it was sort of like a throwaway line in a way, but I said that at some point quite soon, people are going to start questioning, this notion that there are 6,000 schools, or however many there were at that point in time, 2014, 8,000. People are going to start questioning the legitimacy. They're going to start, because these schools have started to move away from what they traditionally used to look like. they don't look like they used to do. They seem to have they've got a different clientele. They seem to have a different purpose. They got a different everything seems to be, a lot of things seem to be very different. And people are going to pick up on this and they're going to start questioning it. And I think we need to be ready for that. So I wrote that comment. And what I didn't realize, well, there were two things. First of all, a couple of people at University of Bath picked up on it. Chris James, Professor Chris James, in particular, picked up on it, and he and also whilst that book was being published in April 2014, so that book was being written. Sorry, it's not being written; it's being published. It was in press. In April 2014, I didn't predict this really, but in 2014, in April 2014, there was a big incident in Jakarta. And the authorities in Indonesia, but mainly Jakarta, where most of the international schools are or were, they started directly questioning the legitimacy of the schools there. They'd noticed that the number of international schools had grown in Jakarta enormously, but the number of expat people hadn't really grown much. So they started working out that the clientele had changed. And they suddenly realized that these schools were taking a lot more Indonesian children, and that was becoming a bit of a concern to them because they didn't realize that. They then realized that these schools weren't accredited. Only about 20% of them were accredited. So they started worrying about the standard of the schools and who's inspecting these schools, what standard are they up to Indonesian standards. They started realizing that they weren't doing an international curriculum. So then they started questioning, are there really 50 international schools in Jakarta? We don't believe it. Yeah, so they actually started to question the legitimacy, which I had sort of semi-predicted at the same time in the book. It was just coming out. It came out in July 2014. It got to the point in Jakarta where the authorities actually said that the schools couldn't call themselves international schools. So even Jakarta International School, which was very similar to the Copenhagen International School that I'd worked at, even that school got questioned in terms of it had been founded by the Australian Embassy in 1956 or something like that. It was, on paper, it was a traditional international school, but even that school was under attack in terms of its legitimacy, and had to prove that it was an international school. It had to change its name. I believe it changed its name to Jakarta Intercultural School, so it kept the JIS brand. But so there was an interesting incident there where the identity and the purpose and the character of schools that had previously not been questioned, it suddenly raised a lot of questions about what are they, and are they international schools? And if they're not international schools, then what? Their legitimacy was questioned. So I mentioned Chris James. So at that time, Professor Chris James and myself and Michael Fertig here at the University of Bath, we set about trying to theorize this, bringing in, and Professor Chris James, his background was in institutionalization theory, and he gave a framework which I didn't know about, which just happened to really support. It gave a framework for us to actually theorize what was going on. So we used this institutionalization theory to develop a couple of papers. So that was sort of what happened in 2014. James, I'll just sort of leave it there if you want to just. Then we'll come back.